Hello, good morning, and I'm Tom Lombardo, Center for Research, Center for Future Consciousness, and this is Module 10 in my webinar series, The Evolution of Science Fiction. And today, I'm going to be highlighting material from 7 chapters in Volume 3 of my science fiction book series. And because it's 7 chapters, I'm really definitely be doing some highlighting. And all 7 chapters basically have to do with the 1930s. An awful lot went on in science fiction during the 1930s. So we're gonna have a whole 2-hour webinar on the 1930s, chapters 1 through 7 in Volume 3. And the title I gave to the whole thing was Space Operas, the Astounding, Pulps, Talkies, the Horrific, and the Cosmic. And up there on the screen are some iconic and classic book covers and movie posters of some important stories or cinema films that were produced during the 1930s. A great image in the middle there is the image created by Hans Bach, who I showed you before, one of the early very good science fiction artists for John Campbell's Who Goes There, which we'll come to later on. Frankenstein is up there, and as well as Karl Čapek's very famous War with the Newts. And down at the bottom, there's an image of the one of the most famous pulp magazine covers ever of H.P. Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time, which I will come back to. So a lot of things went on both in film and in writing, and a lot of significant writers emerged during the time. In fact, a way to look at today is to think about and focus in on the number of important new writers, science fiction writers, that came on the scene during the 1930s. And I'm going to highlight perhaps about a dozen of them that are of significance. I'm also going to talk about the continued evolution of superheroes in the cinema. But some key writers that I will spend some time with are Murray Leinster and Edmund Hamilton and John Taine and Jack Williamson and Nat Schechner and John Campbell I mentioned already, and H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and Karl Čapek. And we're gonna wind up today with Doc Smith and his very famous space opera series, The Skylark of Space and the Lensman Chronicles. And this is going to take us through a lot of what was going on, as I said, during the 1930s. Each of these writers wrote a ton of stories, a ton of serials that a lot of times turned into novels. So we could only highlight 1 or 2 pieces from each of them. But in the 30s, a significant number of new science fiction writers emerged, and many of them continued to write into the 40s, 50s, and thereafter. Now, the place I want to begin in the 30s is with the ongoing or continued evolution of the superhero. As you remember from last time, I talked about Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, who were 2 of the key superhero-like figures to emerge in the comics. As we move into the 1930s, in both the comics and in pulp magazines, 3 additional significant superhero-like characters emerged, popular ones. The Shadow, which eventually went on the radio as well as being in the magazines and in comics, the Phantom, and Doc Savage. And all of these 3 characters were very popular beginning in the 30s, and they combined together very significant intellectual or mental abilities, physical abilities, and high moral character, which are three of the key elements in the 1930s superheroes, as well as in a lot of the heroes in science fiction. Smart, strong, and good of heart, or morally upright. And that's going to be a key theme in, as I said, in lots of the superheroes and superhero-like characters we see in science fiction, and they clearly are there in the comics and in magazines during the early 1930s. Now, in the 1930s, while these new superheroes were emerging in the comics, a very significant novel was written by Philip Wiley called Gladiator. And this novel came out in 1930. And it was about a man who was born as a child with superhuman strength and grew up trying to figure out for himself what his special purpose in life would be. Besides his superhuman strength, he had a very powerful libido and was a great lover. And if you could see the image on the right-hand side, one of the covers that they came up with for Gladiator shows him surrounded by a bunch of adoring women who presumably are physically and sexually attracted to him. And that wasn't exactly the central theme of the novel, but that was part of the novel. But the character spends his whole life struggling with trying to figure out what purpose these special physical gifts have for him. And he's frustrated all along the way. Now, this was a very famous novel of the time. And in particular, it was a famous novel because a science fiction fan reviewed it in that science fiction fan's newsletter that he put out. And within a very short period of time thereafter, that science fiction fan began to create the most famous superhero of all, that in high probability was at least in part inspired by Gladiator, who was the man of iron. And that superhero was Superman. Jerome Siegel, who was the writer, and Joe Shuster, who was the artist, produced a story in the early 1930s called The Reign of the Superman. And this is the original cover in the middle there for that story produced in the early 1930s. And they kept developing that character, but couldn't sell it to any magazines until finally, toward the end of the 1930s, in 1938, they sold the idea to Action Comics. And you see on the left-hand side of the screen, the first issue of Action Comics in June of 1938, where Superman appears, lifting up a car. And the popularity of that comic was immense. And very soon, Superman had his own separate comic. And the one on the right shows the first issue of the Superman comics, which came out soon thereafter. And Superman became one of the most influential and popular creations of science fiction. Superman originally did not start off with all of the incredible powers he had. Little by little, over time, more and more powers were given to him. You know, he could jump, but he couldn't originally fly. And he had X-ray vision, and he was susceptible to kryptonite. But there were lots of things that later on became part of his ever-growing set of powers. And Superman may not perhaps have been known for his intellectual powers, but he sure as hell had great physical powers, and he sure as hell had high moral character. Now, what you may or may not know about Superman is that aside from being inspired to some degree by Gladiator, Jerome Siegel was a young Jewish male who was rather small physically and grew up being pushed around by lots of bigger guys in his neighborhood. And he grew up during the time when Hitler and the whole idea of Nazi Superman was emerging in Europe. And he created Superman as an ego ideal of his own male sense of personality in opposition to the bullies in his neighborhood and the biggest bully of all, Hitler's vision of the German Superman. And out of this grew a new kind of phenomena in science fiction, which is that science fiction comic book characters began to have whole universes of other characters and an assortment of villains surrounding them. So we get these ontological bubbles. There is a whole world universe of Superman. There will be a whole world and universe of other characters associated with other superheroes. But Superman has been a steady and persistent popular icon in the comics, the most popular superhero of all, been the model for many other ones for 70, 80 years now. Soon after Superman, in fact, within another year, a second key comic superhero emerged, the Batman. And in the center there, you see the image of the first detective comics in which Batman, or the Batman originally, appears. And notice he's not quite dressed exactly the same way as a Batman originally came to be viewed, but there he is in Detective Comics beating up a bad guy. And of course, there's always bad guys that the superheroes have to fight. And Detective Comics and Action Comics were the same company. So they got a monopoly on the first two big superheroes to emerge. On the right side, you see an issue of Detective Comics where now we have Batman having a sidekick, first appearing, Robin. And then on the left side, you see the first issue of Batman Comics, where Batman finally got his own comic, just like Superman had. And with Superman, as well as with Batman, a whole history gets created of how they became who they were and how they are dedicated to fighting evil and all of the different powers that they have and abilities that they have, how they came to have them. So comics really start taking off in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And young males identify with the superheroes because the superheroes, in a sense, embody the young male's ego ideals. But they're also great figures that fight in the war of good versus evil, which is going to be a common theme through the whole 1930s, not just in comics, but in science fiction too, the war of good versus evil. Now, in the 1930s, movies acquired sound. And up here I have an image from one of the earliest talkie science fiction movies, Just Imagine. And Just Imagine was a big budget production, came out a few years after Metropolis, had incredible special effects. They created a whole super duper modern city in the future. And then they turned the whole thing into a ridiculous comical musical. This is the first science fiction musical. And it came out in 1930, and it's very fascinating to watch. There's tons of predictions in it about what's going to happen in the future. The special effects are great, but the whole plot is shallow as hell, and they have musical scenes in it, and they go to Mars where they meet very comical and stupid Martians in the long run. But it's definitely worth watching. After this one was done, though, Hollywood would not go near science fiction big budget productions for 20 years because this was such an incredible flop. Instead, what happened in the 1930s is that science fiction profitably got welded together or weaved together with horror. The first talkie that came out that was science fiction was Mysterious Island, and Just Imagine. But then we got Frankenstein, and we got The Invisible Man, and The Island of Lost Souls, and we got Dracula, which wasn't exactly science fiction, of course. We got King Kong, and we have a bunch of different Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon serials that were produced during the 30s that were later combined into movies. And we got Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where Frederick March, I believe, won an Oscar for Best Actor of the Year for doing that dual role. You'll note that 3 of H.G. Wells' novels get turned into movies: Things to Come, The Invisible Man, and Island of Lost Souls, which was based on the island of Dr. Moreau. But we have a lot of horror that gets mixed into science fiction, starting with Frankenstein, and then The Bride of Frankenstein, and then The Son of Frankenstein. And so science fiction did get associated with horror. In fact, people thought of Dracula and Frankenstein, which on one hand was based on science fiction, on the other hand, based on the supernatural, as being in the same genre. So science fiction cinema in the 1930s is strongly coupled together with horror. And throughout the 1930s, we're going to see a lot of science fiction, not just in the movies, but in print, that gets coupled together with horrific kinds of visions and macabre visions, such as the kind of things that were developed with Frankenstein and The Island of Lost Souls and The Mummy. Science fiction definitely produces some popular stuff in the 1930s, but it treats science fiction as something which is associated with the terrifying, as opposed to necessarily the imaginative and the cosmic. Now, turning from the cinema, up there I have a picture of a young Isaac Asimov. And Isaac Asimov is going to enter our history right now, because when Isaac Asimov was a very young kid, say around 10, 11, 12 years old, he started to read science fiction magazines back in the early 1930s. And years later, he published a 3-volume series called Before the Golden Age. And they're a selection of his favorite science fiction stories that he read as a kid from the 1930s when he's growing up. And you could buy these, and I highly recommend them. About a decade later, the first really well-known anthology of early science fiction was produced, called Adventures in Time and Space. And it's a collection of stories from the 1930s and 40s as well. Good stuff from that period of time. And a number of the stories I'm going to mention in this part can be found both in Before the Golden Age or in Adventures in Time and Space. And both of them are still, you can still purchase them. And if you'd like to get a feel for what science fiction short stories and novellas were like during that time, and how the young Isaac Asimov was inspired by them, then these are 2 sets to buy. 1 set and 1 big fat book. Adventures in Time and Space is, I think, 800 pages long. So I'm going to be drawing off of these 2 series to start in and talking about the science fiction stories of the 1930s. And the place I'm going to begin is with continuing a theme that I've already started to develop in this webinar series: women in science fiction. In the early 1930s, we had 2 new, very good women science fiction writers come on the scene. Leslie Francis Stone, who I have a picture of, the only picture I could find, the only photo I could find of her, and Sophie Ellis, of which there is no photo anywhere on Google on the web for it. And let me just start with Leslie Francis Stone. And you notice up there, there are 2 images from Air Wonder Stories. This is early 1930s, 1930, 1931. And Air Wonder Stories was produced by Gernsback. I mentioned that earlier. And Leslie Francis Stone wrote 2 stories in those 2 volumes up there called Men with Wings and Women with Wings. And they were stories about, number one, a father who begins to genetically and physically attempt to modify his offspring and descendants so that humans would have wings and be able to do away with physical, mechanical transportation, instead being able to just simply fly around. And in the second one, which takes place 500 years in the future, all humans now have wings and get into a confrontation and eventual peaceful arrangement with the flying women of Venus, who need new mates in order to keep their production going, reproduction going. And they're 2 very fascinating tales on the idea of the development of aerial behavior and aerial physiology, anatomy in women. But the one in particular that she wrote of that time, which is very interesting to read in particular, is The Conquest of Gola. And The Conquest of Gola is about people who live on a planet, and they are all of the leaders are female, and the males are simply used as concubines and servants, and are visited by a bunch of males in big spaceships who tell these women leaders that they want to develop trade relationships with them, and they have to agree to it. And the women who are on this planet, who are vastly superior intellectually and mentally and morally than these male invaders, eventually have to kill them all because the male invaders want to force these women aliens into a trade relationship. And it turns out that the males are from the Earth and the women aliens are the creatures of Venus. And so it's an interesting critique of the aggressive, power-hungry, greedy male mentality in the Western world of the 1930s, where they have to confront and deal with females who are actually superior to them and can't figure out how to handle them. Wetzel's The Creatures of Light is a very good study in the whole issue of the purposeful biological evolution of humanity. It's an argument for genetic engineering. Even though the scenario described, which occurs in Astounding Stories of Superscience, even though it fails as an experiment, the message at the end is that humans must continue to work on biologically and scientifically, technologically evolving ourselves. And it's a very, very good story, a really good story for the 1930s, a very philosophically sophisticated story on why we are evolutionary beings and we should use science and technology to improve ourselves both physically and psychologically. Now, those came out in the early 1930s, both written by competent women at the time. 2 other stories that get highlighted in Asimov's series and Adventures in Time and Space were written by a popular writer of the time, Raymond Gallon. And Old Faithful, which is on the left side, is a famous early story about a Martian scientist who attempts to and eventually make contact with human astronomers. And the story became very famous because Gallon created a very strange and different kind of mind in this Martian, who at the same time one was very sympathetic toward. The one story, though, that he wrote that I thought was exceedingly inventive and imaginative occurs in Adventures in Time and Space, and that was Seeds of the Dusk. And what Gallon attempts to describe in there is an interstellar life form that drifts through the universe in the form of frozen spores. And when it lands on planets, it begins to grow and self-evolve, creating its own chemicals, biochemicals, and then creating its own physical manifestations that are adaptable to the particular planet that it has landed on. So in essence, it's like microscopic programs that are frozen that allow the inherent intelligence in that software to create whatever kind of chemistry and body it needs for whatever kind of planet it lands on. So we have envisioned here a cosmic intelligence that spreads through the universe and adapts to whatever planet it comes in contact with. Very, very good story in thinking about the possibilities of life in the universe and how one could have a interplanetary form of life that would fit in and coordinate with whatever conditions it faced. Now, two of the most popular stories that were written in the 1930s had similar kinds of themes. Both of these stories are in Asimov series, and both of them are also in Adventures in Time and Space. And the theme that they have in common is the theme we've run into already about either shrinking down in size or expanding in size without limit. And I brought that up with The Girl in the Golden Atom and with what was the other one I was thinking of just now? I forgot the name of it. Well, it'll pop into my head again. And The Man from the Atom. In the 1930s, we had Colossus and He Who Shrank. And these, I feel, and people would agree, are the two best stories that were ever done on this issue of miniaturization versus magnification. He Who Shrank involves a scientist who creates a drug that generates shrinkage in him. And he starts to shrink down, and he shrinks down so far, he enters into the universe of an individual atom as a giant being and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks until he becomes commensurable with the size of the beings of planets in that universe. And then he keeps shrinking and he goes down another level. And through a series of levels, he encounters a whole plethora of different kinds of intelligent beings and forms of life. And so instead of traveling into outer space and encountering a variety and diversification of life and forms of civilization, he goes on the same kind of adventure in a state of perpetual shrinkage, going through one kind of world after another. And then one day he shrinks down to become a giant who falls into a lake. And he shrinks down further and runs away from the lake and encounters a science fiction writer who's living in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. He tells the science fiction writer in Cleveland, Ohio, his story and keeps shrinking down and disappears from our world. It's an amazingly fascinating story that Asimov, as a kid, was just blown away by. Going in the opposite direction, Donald Wandry wrote Colossus. And Colossus begins on a giant rocket launch pad that's towering above Mount Everest. And the gentleman gets into this spaceship that begins to accelerate, increasing in velocity and velocity. And as it increases in velocity, it begins to expand. And eventually he emerges in a laboratory with giant beings hovering over him, having ascended up into the next level of existence. And this one turns out to be very, very cosmic, and he meets what seems to be like a similar kind of similar kind of woman that he had left down at the level below. Asimov's favorite story in his 3 volumes, and it's my favorite story in the 3 volumes too, was the story of Timothic of the Corridors. And there is Timothic, and here's some covers from magazine versions of the story. Timothic of the Corridors takes place 10,000 years in the future, where humanity for the last few thousand years has had to be forced to live underground because of being conquered by Venusian invaders. And Timothic decides that he is going to journey from down way below the earth up to the surface and kill one of the Venusian invaders and conquerors. And it's a story of great adventure and courage. It's the kind of story that would appeal to a 10 to 12-year-old kid, or me, who I read it when I was about 30. And it's a real study in how drastically our world could change in the future, and we will forget where we came from, what we were like, and we literally have to start all over again. But it's great adventure, great adventure. And that came out as a trilogy during the 30s. Now, also in the 30s, as probably the most noteworthy of all stories of the 1930s, Stanley Weibaum, and at this point I'm calling these astounding writers of the pulps. Stanley Weibaum was a young guy, I think 25 years old, first story published, A Martian Odyssey. And A Martian Odyssey eventually was voted as the second best science fiction story of all time. See if you could figure out who they voted as the first best science fiction story, not novel. And Weibaum wrote this story about a human journeying across the surface of Mars, where he meets this Martian that the best he could pronounce his name is Tweel. And Tweel becomes a very famous character in science fiction history. There is an image of Tweel on the screen there. Tweel looks a little bit like an ostrich or some kind of a bird. And Tweel seems to be much more intelligent than the human that he meets on Mars. And they enter on this trek across the surface of Mars. And what Weibaum does in this story is he has an incredible amount of humor thrown into the whole thing. Tweel is very fascinating. Tweel makes all kinds of funny sounds. Tweel jumps up into the air and dives into the ground with his nose pointing into the ground, his beak pointing into the ground. And along the way, they meet all different kinds of other kinds of Martians. The sad thing about Weibaum is that very soon after he wrote A Martian Odyssey, he died of cancer when he was very, very young. But A Martian Odyssey preserved his place in science fiction history, came out in 1934, and is considered like one of the great adventure stories on Mars and with aliens in that period of time and even thereafter. And you can see different images of Tweel if you go on Google, because lots of people have tried to imagine what Tweel looked like. So, as I just said, I'm moving now to the theme of astounding writers of the pulps. So instead of just highlighting stories, now I'm going to start really to highlight out significant writers who produced large numbers of stories and novels through the 1930s and often thereafter into the 40s and 50s. And so some of these writers you may know because they continued with fame and popularity long after the 1930s. The first one is Murray Leinster. His real name was William Jenkins, but he wrote under the name of Murray Leinster. And the image I have up there on in the background is an image of a human with a spear next to what looks like a giant bee or a giant wasp. And Leinster, early on in his career, wrote The Mad Planet, which took place, I think, 50 or 100,000 years in the future. And 50 or 100,000 years in the future, almost all plant life and mammalian life on the Earth had disappeared. The Earth had been overrun with giant mushrooms and giant insects. So there were 10-foot long wasps, 20-foot butterflies, foot-long army ants, and humans had become meek and defensive and stupid and hid away from all these giant insects. This is a great imaginative ecological vision. To read The Mad Planet and the sequel, The Red Dust, throws you into a very vividly imagined alternate ecology, an ecology on the Earth, but an ecology on the Earth that's overrun with all different colored huge mushrooms, often poisonous, and giant spiders, and the adventures of this one character where he kills a spider and he learns how to fish. Very, very good. Sideways in Time was another famous story of Leinster. And Sideways in Time introduces a new idea. What if, according to quantum theory of the universe, there are multiple pathways of evolution within the universe with different timelines? And what if we have a time quake and different segments of different times from different universes get mixed up with each other? And so in this story, what happens is that all of a sudden characters find themselves next to prehistoric beings, or the Roman Empire, or the Wild West, or an America where Columbus never discovered and never came over here. And different elements of different timelines all get scrambled up. And in the end, it doesn't completely unscramble. So it's an inventive idea regarding the whole notion of multiple universes and what if they were to totally get unsettled with each other. I also up there some other things that he was famous for: First Contact, and later stories, Exploration Team, because Leinster would write into the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. But he started off as a popular science fiction writer back in the 1920s and the 1930s, and wrote lots of stuff in the various pulp magazines during that period. Now, one of the most popular writers of the 1930s in science fiction was Edmund Hamilton, who generally has been forgotten in contemporary times. But in the 30s, especially the early 30s, he was unquestionably the most popular science fiction writer in science fiction magazines. No question about it. And there he is in his later years with his arm around his wife, Lee Brackett. And Lee Brackett was a science fiction writer too. And Lee Brackett went on to write screenplays for popular Hollywood movies, including writing an early screenplay for The Emperor Strikes Back. But Hamilton, back in the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, beginning with Weird Tales of all things, started to write space operas. And space operas, as we understand it today, were great adventures in outer space with big battleships, usually other aliens invading us or fighting with us, and great battles in outer space. He invented the idea of the interstellar patrol, which was a military force of spaceships 100,000 years in the future, which guards our galaxy against invaders from the outside. It's an interspecies force. So we have aliens and humans working together, defending the Milky Way, not the sun, not the Earth, the Milky Way. And outside the universe, as one example of one of his space operas, is the kind of novel they should unequivocally make into a science fiction movie today, because it involves the whole Milky Way being invaded by tens of thousands of spaceships from another galaxy, and the aliens are these hideous lizard creatures. Now, I mentioned the fact that they were hideous lizard creatures because one of the things that Hamilton was able to do was that he was able to create an unending assortment of aliens and alien civilizations, describing them in great vivid detail. And it was always a question of either the Earth's going to get destroyed, the sun's going to get destroyed, the Milky Way is going to get destroyed, and there will be huge armadas of spaceships which will have to fight it out with invading aliens. And he did this very well. Even though he was basically telling the same story over and over again, he was very good at creating aliens, creating big, big battles. Outside the Universe ends with the longest battle narrative up to that point in time in science fiction, a 20-page battle at the end of it. And that's the one I think they should make into a movie. And Hamilton repeatedly would win Best Science Fiction Story of the Year for his various space operas and other kinds of stories he wrote too. In fact, I just also mentioned, which was a very imaginative notion, what if all of the cities of the world decided that no longer were they going to plant themselves on the ground because they're susceptible to attack from the air, but rather we're going to create giant aerial cities that float through space. And that he wrote for Air Wonder Stories. The title of it was Cities of the Air. And in the story, we have 100 major world cities, each with a population of around 5 million people, with giant motors underneath them, moving around through space and fighting against each other. Hugo Gernsback thought the whole idea was totally scientifically implausible, but Gernsback wanted action stories and people loved it. And I would recommend reading it, even though it might seem implausible that you could have New York flying around in the air or Berlin flying around in the air, but that's what he envisioned in that story. Now, eventually he became the primary author of Captain Future, which some people may have heard of back in the 1940s and 50s. And he sort of lost his credibility then as a serious science fiction writer. But through the 1930s especially, he was, the early 1930s, the most popular writer of the time and was one of the earliest architects of good, action-packed space opera, and with that same theme over and over again. Out there in the unknown are evil aliens, very, very powerful, and we have to defend either the solar system or the whole Milky Way against them. Now, Eric Temple Bell was the president of the Mathematical Association of America. He wrote dozens of books on mathematics and science, but he also liked to write science fiction. And in the 1930s, he wrote a number of science fiction novels, some of which did get serialized in the magazines. And he particularly liked to delve into, as a scientist, the themes of evolution and time travel. I have up an interesting quote from one of his novels. In fact, this one, I believe, is from the Time Stream. And I want to just read to you. I can't see a couple of the words up there. Where are we? Just make sure I get the whole thing. Give me 1 second here. Oh yeah. Science has not all the truth, for all the truth is not known and never will be. Even though there be limits to space and the stars are numbered, yet is the universe infinite. For that is the paradox and essence of life, which sets no bounds to the creations of mind or to their number. And I would propose to you that that's a fundamental ontological argument regarding how one gets an infinite universe of mind out of a finite universe of matter. And keep in mind, Taine or Eric Temple Bell was a significant scientist, significant mathematician of the time, and liked to write science fiction about evolution and about time travel. Up here are his most famous novels during the 1930s. Seeds of Life, I will just highlight out quickly, in which a scientist creates an electrochemical process to accelerate evolution. And in that story, a moron is turned into a genius and decides that he is going to create unlimited power and unlimited production capacities for humanity and give them this benevolent gift. But humanity turns out to be, especially the humanity of business, turns out to be so perverse and greedy and selfish, he ends up deciding to give them something which produces their own destruction. But it's a very good story about the scientist, philosopher mind wanting to benefit humanity, but humanity doesn't seem to want to take the benefit. The time stream is psychedelic. I describe it in my book, and I don't know how to describe it orally, except to say that we have a group of characters who move through time, and it's never very clear what the past, the present, and the future is, because it's kind of dreamlike, the whole process of it. But Temple wrote some very good novels, and as I mentioned, dabbling into time travel and dabbling in evolution during the 30s. Now, Jack Williamson, there's Jack Williamson young, and there's Jack Williamson older. Jack Williamson almost lived to be 100 years old. And he started writing science fiction back in the late 1920s and kept writing it until about 10 years ago when he finally died. He earned a PhD in science fiction and became a professor in science fiction in his middle to later years, and grew up in New Mexico, where he had nothing to do but read science fiction magazines, according to him. And Williamson kept writing through that about a 60-year period, significant science fiction. There are many, many different stories by him that I could highlight, but one I'm going to highlight at this point in time, which is his famous novella, The Legion of Time. Now, if you can see me on the screen, on the right-hand side, you see the woman in the golden flying saucer-like ship. Here's the original magazine. This is 1938. And I got into collecting old science fiction magazines, and this thing here is what, 82 years old. And he wrote this in 1938, and it's a great time travel story, and it introduces the concept of the Jambar point. And the Jambar point refers to the idea that there could be an event in history which, if things go one way, a totally different future unfolds than if things went a different way at that one specific point in time. Similar in ways to the butterfly effect applied to the evolution of time. And in this story, we have a gentleman who is friends with a man who's interested in time travel and the study of time. And he is visited by this very mysterious woman who wants him to come into the future with him. And as it turns out, there are two alternative futures, each of which has a beautiful woman who is tempting him to come forward into her future universe, for future Earth. And the term, the Jambor point, has to do with the fact that in the early 20th century, there is going to be a man living in Arkansas named John Barr, who's walking across a field. And as he walks across the field, he looks down at a certain point in time, and either he sees a rusted old magnet lying on the ground and picks it up, or he doesn't pick it up. If he picks it up, he becomes a famous scientist with a whole new theory of magnetism, and the whole Earth history goes one direction. If he doesn't pick it up, he just turns into a nobody in Arkansas, and history goes in an entirely different direction. And these two women from futures, alternative futures, fight it out with each other over whether John Barr picks up the magnet or not. And so we have a time war. And keep in mind what that means. We have beings from the future who are attempting to manipulate the present or the past to produce a certain effect into the future. And whether or not one woman gets realized in actuality or the other woman gets realized in actuality depends upon whether this oaf down in Arkansas picks up a magnet or not. And at the end, the whole situation gets resolved. Now, Williamson is very sophisticated, and he builds up this whole time travel scenario and this looping through time using quantum physics, again, with the idea of multiple universes and multiple possibilities lying ahead. Now, many other stories by Williamson, I'll come back to him, but the Legion of Time became one of his most famous early stories in 1938. Now, Nat Schechner is another writer of the period who has been sort of forgotten, although was very popular in the 1930s. In fact, in the middle of the 1930s, he kept having the cover stories of Astounding stories, like 2 or 3 times, 4 times a year. And Schechner was one of Asimov's most favorite writers of the time. And Schechner, I can best describe as someone who liked to experiment with the nature of reality. For example, imagine you build a super AI that can create an ontological bubble in which a different set of mathematical and geometrical principles apply, and let the thing begin to evolve with an alternative universe, with alternative mathematics than what we have in our present world, in our present universe, and it begins to seep out into our world. That's the living equation. Imagine that you have a scientist who is able to crystallize human thought and put it into a spherical containment with the minds of multiple geniuses and go look for the ultimate equation. That's crystallized thought. Imagine you have beings of the future who get bored with existence and decide to manipulate the laws of quantum physics, making the indeterminacy principle even more probabilistic, thus increasing the range of chaos throughout the entire universe. That's called the orb of probability. Imagine you have 3 characters, one who lives in the past, the deep past, one who lives in the present, and one who lives in the future, coming together and going on adventures, past, present, and future. And finally, imagine if all scientists across the world get sick and tired of politicians, bankers, and businessmen and decide to take control of the world. That's called the revolt of the scientists. Schechner wrote a ton of different stories in the middle part of the 1930s, and he had a degree in law and had a degree in chemistry and went on to write American history. So he was very prolific for 10 years in science fiction, very popular, and wrote experiments in reality. That's the best way I could describe him. So one last writer here, and then we'll take a break, of the Pulps, John Campbell. John Campbell is best remembered for writing in 1938 Who Goes There? And Who Goes There involves a story about an alien spaceship that crashes in the Antarctic. And the spaceship froze in the Antarctic tens of millions of years ago. And scientists uncover the spaceship and extract from it a frozen alien and decide to thaw it out. But the thing looks hideous through the ice. And when it thaws out, it gets loose. And it is very quickly discovered that this alien can mimic the appearance of any other living creature that it takes in any sample of that living creature's body. And so it begins to spread in various impersonations throughout the, the science station down in the Antarctica. And you can't tell by looking at the individual whether that's an alien in disguise or not. It's an ultimate story of paranoia. It's been done 3 times over in the movies. The story itself is better than any of the movies that were made of it, because the story really gets into the problem solving and the bleak paranoia kind of atmosphere of wondering who around you is an alien wanting to consume you and who's not. And also in the story, which they leave out in the movies, is the alien could read your minds too. So that's a good spot to stop for a moment with John Campbell. And John Campbell will eventually become the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, but early on he was a very accomplished science fiction writer during the 1930s. Okay, so that's a good place to stop.
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm back. Okay, and Jeannie's coming in a second. But anyway, let's keep going. Okay, so we just did Who Goes There with John Campbell, and Who Goes There by John Campbell was voted for the first 2/3 of the 20th century as the best science fiction novella of all time. So it became very, very popular, and we'll talk about Campbell in another couple sessions when we talk about the golden age when he became the editor of Astounding. But first, let's go to Experiments in Reality and Consciousness. And here's an image created by Geiger, who I've mentioned before and everyone's familiar with from Alien. And Geiger sort of fits the next author. And as I quote from him, not Geiger, but the next author: shrieking, slithering, torrential shadows of red, viscous madness chasing one another through endless and sanguine corridors, a purple, fulgurous sky, formless phantasms, and kaleidoscopic mutations of a ghoulish, remembered scene. Who the hell is that? H.P. Lovecraft. Now, here's an image, one among many, of one of Lovecraft's most famous creations, the super intelligent beings of the far distant past from the shadow out of time. This was actually made into a movie, which is awful, but just recommend read the story. And here's the famous image cover from Astounding Stories, where the shadow out of time appeared in 1936, I think. Yeah, 1936. And H.P. Lovecraft acquired a very powerful reputation, mythic vision among his fans and readers pretty much after he died, and he died relatively young. But while he was alive, he wrote a series stories that mix together the absolutely horrendous and heinous and macabre and ghoulish and horrific with science fiction. And here's some of the images from some of his more famous stories, like The Call of the Cthulhu, and The Shadow over Innsmouth, and The Dunwich Horror, and The Whisperer in Darkness, and The Color Out of Space, which was made into a movie, At the Mountains of Madness, and then The Shadow Out of Time. And I said that Lovecraft, in my view, was one of the best of the writers of the 1930s, along with his friend, who I'll come to in a minute. And he was very, very good at creating very vivid and graphic scenes and situations with elaborate, bizarre elements to them, and terrifying and monstrous creatures that haunted those situations. You could read all of his best stuff in H.P. Lovecraft, The Complete Fiction, that you could order, and all of this is in there in one place now. Lovecraft would wander the streets at night and had an odd looking expression on his face all the time, kind of like a stone being. And in a lot of ways, his characters in his novels sort of embody his own personality. And like I said, he did a lot of very interesting stuff. Some that I've mentioned to people that I think are especially worth reading are The Rats in the Walls, which is a story about human cannibalism. The Outsider, which is a very famous one about a being who never sees himself in a mirror and then scares the hell out of himself when he finally sees himself. The Color Out of Space, in which some kind of infectious alien descends to the earth and takes up home in a well on a farm and turns everything around it into putrid, decaying material. The Dunwich Horror, in which this woman produces two giant deformed twins, and The Whisperer in Darkness, in which aliens in Vermont take over the body of an individual in this farmhouse. These are all very, very spooky, very, very graphic. The Dreams of the Witch Hunt House, very good. When he gets to The Mountains of Madness, which is his longest piece of work, he invents the most elaborate and mind-boggling description of a non-human city that up to that point in time. And it just is phenomenally intricate and imaginative. Lovecraft did not believe in the supernatural. He believed that everything he described in his stories were consequences of the way the universe deeply was. He believed that we have been visited and inhabited by other beings from other realms and other planets throughout our history, running back millions and millions of years. In The Shadow Out of Time, which I think is his best, along with The Mountains of Madness, he envisions a professor who one day goes into a state of amnesia for 5 years and then wakes up out of it and has these increasingly vivid dreams that he is existing in some strange giant library. And when he looks down at his body, finally, he realizes that his body is not human, but is the body of that vision that you saw on the cover of the Shadow Out of Time issue from the magazine. And it eventually becomes apparent that his mind has been transported millions of years into the past and is housed in this alien being, and his sole purpose is to record the history of his life and the history of humanity. And as is revealed, there are this great race, as it's called, these beings who have traveled through the universe for tens of millions of years to different planets, just recording the experiences of different forms of intelligence all over the place. This is a kind of antecedent to Last and First Men. Eventually, he discovers his own handwriting in an uncovered archaeological find in Australia, tens of millions of years old, which finally convinces him that he actually was drawn mentally back into the past. I highly recommend reading Lovecraft. Lovecraft gets a bad reputation sometimes for being a bit too macabre, but his language, his literary abilities, his imagination, his capacity to invent the bizarre are unexcelled, and he carries the revolting to a high level of aesthetic achievement. And he's very cosmic at the same time, Lovecraft early on became friends in his life with this guy, Clark Ashton Smith. And Lovecraft lived in New England, Smith lived in California. There's an image here I have, it's a double image of one of Smith's famous stories, City of Singing Flame, of the Singing Flame. But when Clark Ashton Smith was in his early 20s, he wrote an epic poem, The Hashish Eater, or The Apocalypse of Evil, to get a sense of Smith's writing abilities. And Smith was a poet to begin with. Bow down, I am the emperor of dreams. I crown me with a million-colored sun of secret worlds incredible, and take their trailing skies for vestment when I soar, thrown down the morning zenith and illume the space-flown horizon infinite. Smith was the most poetic of science fiction writers of the 1930s. And Lovecraft and him had an intense letter correspondence and friendship for 10, 15, maybe 20 years, never met each other in person. And Smith, living in California, and there's an image of Smith when he's young and an image of Smith when he's older, in the 1930s, started writing fantasy, horror, and science fiction because the Depression was on and he needed to find some way to earn money to support him and his parents who were living with him. And in a 6-year period, sold 100 stories to Weird Tales, to Wonder Stories, to Astounding Stories, to various other places. And I highly recommend, you can go on Amazon Prime, and there is a movie made about Clark Ashton Smith called The Emperor of Dreams. And it's a very good movie, given a sense of the multi-talent ability of this guy, who didn't have much of an education, but clearly had the capacity to write lyrical science fiction far superior to anybody else, except for Lovecraft, during the 1930s. By the way, I should also mention, if you're interested, there are several Amazon videos done on Lovecraft too, but the one on Clark Ashton Smith is very good, The Emperor of Dreams. And there's lots of different stories that Clark Ashton Smith wrote during the 1930s, and I can't really talk about them at great length, but I will just simply mention 3 quickly, one of which we have the idea that there is a single living creature that has spread across the entire surface of Mars and is a single intelligence and communicates with the Earth. It's a planetary single life form that envelops the entire surface and observes what's going on in outer space and comes and makes a proposition to humanity. And that's a very fascinating tale on planetary life and planetary consciousness. The Monster of the Prophecy, another one by him, is about a poet who is about to kill himself and is then approached by what looks like a human, but is really an alien. And he's taken off to to another planet where he is there because he is fulfilling a prophecy, the prophecy of the monster, of a being with one head, two arms, two legs, and pale skin, because the beings on this planet have 8 legs, 6 arms, a red rooster topping to their head, and more than 2 eyes. And he lives there and eventually becomes lovers with one of them. Very fascinating story. And then a third one by him, which I would recommend, is The Dimension of Chance, in which an airplane flies into an alternate universe in which everything is chaotic. There are no two things that are exactly alike. The universe goes topsy-turvy. And it's an interesting experiment in a reality in which there is no natural law or order to things, and humans having to find a way about through it. So if Clark Ashton Smith was the greatest poetical science fiction writer of the time, and Lovecraft was the best writer of science fiction horror of the time, then in the 1930s, the best science fiction comedian of the time is to come. And for that, we're going to turn to plays, epics, disasters, and the radio. In the first couple of decades of the 20th century and then into the 1930s, in Czechoslovakia, Karl Čapek, who studied philosophy and politics, eventually earning a PhD in philosophy, wrote, as a journalist and a novelist, an immense amount of very popular fiction and nonfiction, and became one of the great writers, most highly honored popular writers in Czechoslovakia. He became world famous when he, together with his brother, wrote a play called Rur, R-U-R, Rossum's Universal Robots. Čapek is acknowledged as being the person who invented the term robot. Actually, it was robota, from the Czech for indentured servant, and actually it was his brother who came up with the term, not him. But Rossum's Universal Robots was made into a play in which humans create robots to do all the work for humanity. It begins with a scientist, Rossum, who wants to prove the non-existence of God by creating life, creating a robot, but his son finds out about it and thinks it's a good money-making proposition and locks his father away to do further experiments and starts a business making robots. But the robots eventually become sufficiently self-aware that they don't want to serve humanity anymore. And so they kill all the humans on the earth, except for one. And in the end, they learn how to reproduce. Now, the play, although that sounded gruesome going through it, is very, very funny. And that's what Čapek was good at. He was good at taking fundamental flaws and weaknesses as he saw them in humanity. In this case here, greed and business and having a lower class do all the work for you, and turning it into a comical satire and throwing philosophy in on top of it. In The Absolute at Large, which comes out a few years later, we have a gentleman who creates a machine that can totally convert matter into energy, which he calls the carburetor. But in converting matter into energy, what the machine does is it lets loose the spirit of God onto the world. Because according to the theory that God is the immanent spirit in everything, by turning everything, matter, into energy, we release the spirit of God onto the world. And what happens is that the world becomes both super productive in the sense of producing an excess of everything due to God's infinite creative power, and everybody becomes religious fanatics and enters into a war, a world war, over which religion is correct, in which all but 8 soldiers out of 200 million who enter the war are killed. And at the end, humanity has to start all over again. And in there, we see Spinoza and Schechner and other philosophers and scientists being turned into a comedy. We see the priests and the religious order turned into a comedy as well, too. And he turns the whole idea that God is in the universe into a farce. His best, though, his most profound and elaborate comical science fiction was War with the Newts. And that sounds like a stupid story, and it was one of the most deep and comprehensive science fiction novels of the first half of the 20th century, because Chapek talks about everything in that novel, from technology to economics to ecology to sociology to education. He brings it all in, entertainment, movie stars, the whole thing. And the story has to do with the fact that one captain in the Pacific Ocean who runs a pearl hunting business discovers these intelligent lizards and trains them to dive for pearls. And one thing leads to another, and eventually the world depends upon newts, lizards, for its whole economy. And the lizards keep multiplying till finally they decide they have to recarve up the continents because they don't have enough shoreline for their immense population. And humanity gets decimated by the end of the whole thing. Chapek was a critic of big business, mass production, fascism, communism, human greed, and he kept trying to lampoon it through his novels. And he dies in 1938, and 3 months after he died, and he died of lung cancer, I think because he was a heavy cigarette smoker, but 3 months after he's died, when the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia, they came looking for him because he was considered public enemy number 2 in Czechoslovakia by the Nazis. But he had been dead for 3 months. But those 3 stories in particular are definitely worth reading because they are hilarious and they are all philosophically informed. He had a PhD in philosophy. Now, another famous disaster of the time, written in 1932 by Philip Wiley, that's Gladiator, together with Edmund Hamilton, was When Worlds Collide. And When Worlds Collide, in my opinion, was the best the best world disaster novel written up to that point in time. It was based on the idea that 2 rogue planets are moving into our solar system, and one is going to collide with the Earth and destroy the Earth, and that humans have to figure out some way to get off of the Earth and settle someplace else because the Earth is done for. And Wiley and Balmer do a very good job of describing the tension and drama of the whole population of our world, realizing that the end is near. And I know in contemporary Hollywood cinema, this scenario has been done over and over and over again. But this is clearly the seminal or the originative starting point for that scenario, and it was done excellently by the 2 of them. And eventually, humans do settle on another world and afterworlds collide. But the first one is much better than the second one because the first one goes through the whole drama of how we're going to get off of the Earth and how any of us are going to survive. And it mixes together science and religion because the ships that take off from the Earth in the end are envisioned like modern versions of Noah's Ark. And there's a lot of biblical references in it, but it's science in the end that saves us. Science builds the rocket ships that help us to leave the Earth. Now, in the 1930s, I think one of the best science fiction epics was written as a novel. It came out as a series in science fiction pulp magazines. But The Man Who Awoke by Lawrence Manning is been described as the first science fiction novel in the pulps that seriously attempted to extrapolate on present trends and times into the future to see how things would occur or go in the coming centuries. And Manning in that novel anticipates the loss of natural resources, the climate change, excessive pollution and waste, the exhausting of fossil fuel resources, overpopulation. In fact, he hits on almost every one of the commonly identified critical environmental crisis points in our present world. And that's only in The Forest People, the first book in the series. Where Manning eventually goes is that he has a character who keeps moving ahead 5,000 years at a time into the future. And as he moves ahead 5,000 years at a time, he sees where humanity is at each point. At 5,000 AD, 10,000 AD, 15,000 AD, 20,000 AD, and finally 25,000 AD. And he sees different kinds of human civilizations arise and fall. He sees a world ruled by super brains. He sees a world that's reduced to living in the forest. He sees a world where everybody spends their whole life in virtual reality. He sees a world in which everybody has become an anarchist. And finally, he moves 25,000 years ahead, and he comes upon a scientist who in 25,000 AD has discovered the secret to immortality. And when he takes the drug, he becomes immortal, the man who awoke. And so the final part of the novel traces his life out till 10 to 20 million years into the future, in search of the meaning of existence and in search of the next level up in human conscious evolution. Eventually meeting gurus and sages and creating temples of thought where people try to merge their minds together into a higher level of consciousness, and comes to the conclusion at the end that the meaning of life is to continue to evolve and search and grow and explore, and there is no final answer to the whole thing. And it's a very moving, powerful novel, not only because how good it is at predicting the immediate present, but how cosmic it is at heading out into the far, far distant future to see what's going to happen in the thousands, if not millions of years ahead in time. Now, as one final element in plays, epics, disasters, and the radio, toward the end of the decade, Orson Welles produced, as you all probably know, on the night before Halloween, 1938, a radio show in which he enacted H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, transporting it from England, where the novel took place, to New Jersey. And apparently, a lot of people believed that the Martians really were invading New Jersey. And lots of people had different explanations for how this could be, but here's one from the Chicago Tribune. Why did people fall for this? It would be more tactful to say that some members of the radio audience are a trifle retarded mentally, and that many a program is prepared for their consumption. Now, if that doesn't describe today, what does? This is 1938. And part of the reason probably for people reacting as if this was really going on is that, number one, science fiction had more and more entered into public consciousness. And secondly, people were becoming increasingly worried over the rising Nazi threat and trouble in Europe. And so the pump was primed. And just like it's come up before, as I've been talking through this whole series on how science fiction can influence events like future war novels, influencing people getting prepared for war and having itchy trigger fingers. Science fiction can be influenced by current events, where we have people gullibly, because of having an invasion mindset going on in their heads, believing that the Martians were really invading us. But this also just goes to show that by the late 1930s, science fiction was really in public consciousness, and science fiction through Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and the movies that have come out, people were aware of the idea of aliens and aliens invading us, and the whole notion of a battle of good and evil in the universe. It was there, and people being gullible about it or not. So, given that, I'm going to come to the last writer and the last set of stories for the 1930s. And I've saved the most grandiose and gigantic imagination to the end. The evolution of space opera, the history of civilization, the limits of scientific plausibility, the greatest conspiracy theory ever created, and colossal techno-inventiveness, and that is Doc Smith. Doc Smith got a PhD in chemical engineering, ended up working in the industry of children's cereals and donuts, but decided when he was fairly young that he wanted to write a big science fiction adventure story. And believing that he couldn't do women very well or romance, he recruited his best friend's wife to add into the plot a feminine point of view. Beginning in 1915, he started writing The Skylark of Space. And it took him 5 years finally to finish it. And starting in 1920, started submitting it to science fiction magazines, but nobody would publish it because they said it was too far out. Finally, in 1928, it was published. The first Skylark, The Skylark of Space, was serialized and published in Amazing Stories. Gernsback published it. And that was when Smith and his gargantuan space operas took off. And Brian Aldiss, who was a science fiction writer and historian, has referred to Doc Smith as the glamorous disease of giganticism. And by that, Aldiss meant that no matter how big and powerful and colossal one could imagine, spaceships, battles, physical forces, weaponry, aliens, Doc Smith exceeded them all. Doc Smith went ultra cosmic, ultra gigantic. Eventually, he created spaceships, believe it or not, that were thousands of miles long, just spaceships, starting with The Skylark of Space. He wrote two fundamental or pivotal space opera series. The Skylark of Space series, which was 4 novels, which are copies of covers are up there on the screen. And then he wrote his big creation, the Lensman series, which was 6 novels altogether. And the images are up there on the bottom for the 6 volumes of the Lensman series. And in fact, here I have up the names of the 4 in the Skylark series and the 6 in the Chronicles of the Lensman, plus dates when these were published. Just as some basic points to start with. In 1935, Wonder Stories was the most popular science fiction pulp magazine. In 1935, and here we go again, Astounding Stories published the first part of Skylark of Valoron, boosted their sales by 10,000 copies on that issue, and Astounding took over as the biggest selling science fiction magazine after that point in time. and it was due to Doc Smith's Skylark of Valoron. And when all is said and done, in terms of how well the narrative was told and the level of imagination, I would say that this is my favorite of the 10 up there. And these are, to read 10 of these things is a challenge, to say the least. The Skylark series, the 4 volumes, is around 1,000 pages. The Lensman series clocks in at about 1,800 pages by the time you get through it all. And Doc Smith invents aliens a mile a minute. They're an amazing assortment of different aliens, good and bad, that come up in his novels. In his first novel, The Skylark of Space, he immediately, almost, not quite on the first few pages, but very soon thereafter, exceeds the speed of light, which is presumably scientifically impossible. The Skylark, the first spaceship created, goes faster than the speed of light. He creates this evil human, Blackie Duquesne, who follows the good human, Seaton, through the whole 4 novels, attempting to kill him. He starts up this, what turns into husband and wife team, Seaton and Dorothy, who he modeled after him and his wife, and a second couple, Crane and Peg, who he modeled after his good friends, the lady being the one who helped him to write the first novel. And those 4 characters go through the whole 4 novel series. In fact, you'll see that even though Doc Smith does super colossal, super science space operas, he has these down-home human couples who are the heroes of these novels and fight vast, incredible evil forces across the saga. Where he gets more colossal in scope is with Lensman, because in Lensman, what he envisions is that billions of years ago, super powerful evil intelligences called the Endorians first observed the Milky Way and decide that they want to control our whole galaxy. And they begin to manipulate events through our whole galaxy, including the Earth, that are compatible with their evil ends. And so everything that has gone bad and wrong in human civilization up to the present is due to the Endorians' manipulations. Hitler, Genghis Khan, all of the hideous villains of our history, all were puppets of the Endorians. But 2 billion years ago, the Arisians, who were super powerful, good aliens, decided that they needed to fight against the Endorians, and they needed to genetically guide the development of super intelligent, super powerful beings that would fight against and eventually defeat the Endorians. And those genetically guided individuals were the Lensmen. And in the Lensmen, the central characters are Lensmen who have on their wrists these techno devices through which they have all kinds of powers, both physical and mental, that they can exert on physical objects and on the minds of other people and other beings. And so you follow the Chronicles of the Lensman through 6 novels where they are continuously fighting against the evil Endorians with the help of the Arisians, who are teaching them all kinds of new mental powers, including the capacity to invade the minds of other beings and manipulate other beings' thoughts we get especially even more conspiracy theory going here, because the Arisians are able to manipulate thoughts, and so are the lensmen. And it's one big battle after another through the whole series, in fact, through Skylark and through the lensmen. Each novel ends with a bigger battle than the one before. In Skylark of Duquesne, a whole galaxy is obliterated, and trillions of aliens are killed. In the Lensman series, we have two ancient super powerful aliens, good and evil, fighting it out with each other, and this selective evolution of the Lensmen being the heroes in it, where eventually the Adorians and their whole civilization are destroyed. It's interesting that Doc Smith created an unending series of ever more powerful and intricate and bedazzling types of physical technologies. But in the end, he believed that mind was more powerful than matter. And what the lensmen eventually achieve is the capacity, using their minds, just thought, to annihilate and destroy anything physical. In fact, they eventually transcend the lens. They're able to do it just by thinking. So they achieve this kind of omnipotent power with their minds over anything physical. And so even though Smith, educated as a chemical engineer and thinking in terms of super duper technologies, the 1,000-foot spaceship, Skylark of Valeron, and blowing up galaxies, and technologies that allow you to communicate instantaneously across the entire universe. And in fact, in the Lensman series, we have a thinking spaceship, various thinking spaceships where minds interface with physical machines. In the end, Smith thought that the ongoing evolution of the universe, the history of civilization, and he put it, was going to be this ascension of power of mind over matter. The odd thing was, even though he envisions these purposively evolved, super intelligent lensmen with incredible psychic powers and physical powers, he portrays them as if they are down-home, homey kind of characters who live in 1930s America. That is, his vision of a future evolved human is no bigger or broader than his neighbors, what his neighbor is like, or he is like. So they, the Lensman series is considered the great science fiction space opera of all time, the best one of all time. And it's a monstrosity of imagination, giganticism, and it takes us up to the person who will exceed, I'm not going to do the review here, the person who will exceed Smith in cosmic imagination, which is who I'm going to talk about next time exclusively, which is Olaf Stapleton, who comes at the far distant future and comes at the evolution of mind totally different than Doc Smith does. But it's worth thinking about Doc Smith, because Doc Smith definitely had a cosmic mind and definitely got into future evolution, but Stapleton gets into it more deeply, more broadly, more expansively than Smith did. And so next time, that's what we'll discuss, is Olaf Stapleton and the cosmic perspective on the future of humanity and the universe. And I'm just going to talk about 5 novels by Stapleton: Last and First Men, Last Men in London, John, Cirrus, and Star Maker. So that's the end for today. And I'm sorry that I went all the way till 2 o'clock, not 2 o'clock, 12 o'clock.